In addition to the civil rights movement, the 1960s big issue was Vietnam. In fact, there's a lot of overlap between people that protested Vietnam and the civil rights movement, or in the civil rights movement. Um, Vietnam becomes a wedge between conservatives and liberals. We're going to see that hawks tended to be conservative, the ones that wanted to fight the war. Liberals tended to be doves, or not wanting to fight the war. Um, but we need to understand how the Vietnam War got started, because it didn't start in the 60s, didn't even start in the 50s. It started all the way back in the 40s as a result of the post-World War II conflict between capitalism and communism, this Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. Um, After World War II, many of the European powers on the Allied sides were trying to reinvigorate or reestablish their control over their previous colonies. The one that we're concerned about here is the French control of Southeast Asia. The territory known as Vietnam was controlled by the French, and it was a French colony. And a nationalist force known as the Viet Minh, nationalism meaning they wanted Vietnam to be just for the Vietnamese, and they wanted to kick out their colonial oppressors, in their view, known as the French. The Viet Minh were led by a man named Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was a communist. Now, because of the Cold War, there was a fear that communism was spreading and that all communism was being directed by the Soviet Union and China as well. So this fear that communism might spread into Southeast Asia went against the stated United States policy of containment. So the United States offered money to France. Both the Truman and the Eisenhower administration sent both arms and money to France in order to help prop up the French control in Southeast Asia. However, the French are going to be defeated by the Viet Minh, and it's this really interesting dilemma. This nationalist Vietnamese force was able to defeat a European power. The French and the Vietnamese went to Geneva, Switzerland, in order to sign a treaty known as the Geneva Accords. They decided to split Vietnam in half at the 17th parallel until elections could be held to decide what kind of government would be in place. As we'll see, this election never actually is held. The United States administration believed that Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh were being controlled by the communist forces either in Beijing or Moscow. So they were afraid that this was one step in that domino theory that would lead to the spread of communism around the world. The domino theory being if one country falls, the country next to it will fall, and the country next to it will fall. And to allow the fall of South Vietnam to communism would mean that eventually all of Southeast Asia would fall, and that ruins the whole point of the containment policy. So the United States felt like it needed to prop up the South Vietnamese government. The problem with that was that the South Vietnamese government was an incredibly corrupt and unpopular government. The leader of the South Vietnamese government was a Catholic and tried to force Catholicism onto a region that was majority Buddhist. They took a lot of money that was meant to help the poor citizens in Vietnam and pocketed it. Eisenhower supported this government after the South Vietnamese government decided not to hold elections. The reason that it decided not to hold elections was because it would have lost to Ho Chi Minh because the South Vietnamese wanted to have the North Vietnamese united with it. In response to Eisenhower's government and the South Vietnamese corruption, many South Vietnamese organized into what was known as the Viet Cong, a resistance organization to the South Vietnamese government. The United States supplied money and weapons initially to the South Vietnamese government. They also sent military advisors, which are troops trying to help the South Vietnamese government. North Vietnam actually supplied weapons and soldiers to the Viet Cong. Later, they're going to use something called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which actually went outside of the Vietnamese territory and into South Vietnam, which became a problem. The United States, though, could not allow this to happen out of fear that the domino theory would take place and we would lose the battle with communism if we did not support the South Vietnamese government. Eisenhower was in office from 1952 to 1960, and he had increased the support financially and sending some military advisors to the unpopular South Vietnamese government. When Kennedy took office in 1960, he continued on the Eisenhower program. Then he was unsuccessful in 1960 to overthrow the communist regime in Cuba in what's known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, which you should remember from the previous information. So in order to prevent the fall of South Vietnamese democracy or government to the North Vietnamese communists, Kennedy also began to steadily increase the number of military advisors in South Vietnam. In other words, he's starting to build up a military presence, an American military presence in the area. As time went on, the South Vietnamese government became more and more unpopular. They took a lot of the money that was designed to help the countryside, rural Vietnamese, and just kept it for themselves, very corrupt. The government of South Vietnam began to see its public support dwindle even more. And then the United States CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, supported a coup where the president of South Vietnam was assassinated. This occurred shortly before President Kennedy was assassinated himself. When President Johnson took office in 1963, it largely continued initially Kennedy's program of continuing to supply military advisors and financial assistance to South Vietnam. Now, initially, Lyndon Johnson continued Kennedy's program of financial assistance and military advisors to the South Vietnamese. In 1964, the same year of the Civil Rights Act, by the way, Lyndon Johnson also went to Congress to describe the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which led to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was a exaggerated, possibly even made up incident where a North Vietnamese gunship attacked a United States naval vessel. The important part of this is that it was now perceived that North Vietnam had attacked Americans, and therefore we should be able to respond in kind. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was Congress's response to the description of this incident. In this resolution, they essentially gave the American president, in this case Johnson, the ability to use and build up American troops in South Vietnam without an official authorization of Congress. This means that the United States was never in a declared war with Vietnam, and the 500,000 troops that were sent to Vietnam by 1967 were there as more of an engagement than an actual war. Later, it's pretty well proven in the Pentagon Papers that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was made up, and the Johnson administration was afraid to back out of this in order to be, that would allow the conservatives to call him soft on communism. So Johnson actually ramped up the attacks in Vietnam by sending over 500,000 troops, also initiating a bombing campaign known as Operation Rolling Thunder in North Vietnam. It completely devastated the area. Not really understanding the logistics and efforts that would be made by the North Vietnamese in this fight. As the number of troops in Vietnam increased under the Johnson administration, so did the opposition back home. Vietnam began to be seen as the poor man's fight or the poor man's war because there was a draft in the United States, a conscription law where people were drafted to fight in the military. If your number was called, you reported to the draft station and you were sent over to Vietnam. This draft became to be seen as unfair because some men were able to be granted exemptions. You might be able to get a medical exemption. You might be able to get a college deferment. Typically, to get a college deferment, though, you'd have to be able to afford college. There was no FAFSA or student loans as like we have today. So that was seen as a rich way out of the military. You might be able to get enlisted into the National Guard. But again, there were so many people that wanted to get into the Guard, you had to have political connections. Famously, George W. Bush was in the Texas National Guard during Vietnam. The medical exemptions, like Donald Trump got medical exemptions because of bone spurs. Or some people were fleeing the country in order to avoid service. Bill Clinton, for example, lived in Canada for a few years to avoid the draft. So what happens is this becomes seen as a poor man's fight because the wealthy were able to find ways to get out of the draft. African Americans as well served in large numbers as ground troops. So it was perceived as a war fought by poor and minority troops and directed back home by wealthy white politicians. The organizations that had formed to fight McCarthyism back in the 50s and then the Civil Rights Movement during the 1960s turned their attention to the war. And these organizations had known how to protest and they knew how to make their voices heard. In fact, some soldiers, as they came home, even joined the protest. Because of the draft, not everybody that went wanted to go. As the protests become more and more showy, as they become more provocative, it really does turn off some of the public support for the protesters. They burned draft cards. Some of them committed acts of violence later on. This becomes much more difficult to support the opposition. And we have, again, a wedge between the liberal doves that didn't want to fight the war, tended to go into the counterculture area, and the hawks, who tended to be more supportive of the war and the military. Much like its impact on the civil rights movement, television had a huge impact on the Vietnam War. The media device was present in Vietnam, showing soldiers in the field. Dan Rather, who used to be a nightly news anchor on a major network, was actually in the field interviewing soldiers. So television had a big role in this war, and it really drove a wedge between the hawks and the doves. One interesting thing happened in January of 1968. Up until that point, the United States felt like it was winning the war. They had a thing called a body count, where they would count the number of Vietnamese killed in battle compared to the United States soldiers killed in battle, and it was clear that we were killing more of them than us, and we had not had any major losses. We thought we were winning the war up until that point. And then in January of 1968, on the night of Tet, a holiday in Vietnam, the Viet Cong launched something called the Tet Offensive. Now, what you need to understand is that South Vietnam was seen as our home base. It was seen as our safe space, and we were supposed to be fighting the North Vietnamese. But the Viet Cong are South Vietnamese resistance fighters, terrorists, I guess, depending on your perspective. The Viet Cong forces attacked 30-some different bases in South Vietnam within an hour of each other on the same night of Tet, a day that we thought was going to be sort of a relatively easy day. All of this was broadcast on television. And because of the fact that the Viet Cong forces showed that they could attack anytime, anywhere, even with what we saw as our safe space, the American public really turned against the Vietnam War at that point. Throughout the 67 and 68 fighting, public opinion really began to split on Vietnam, and it really harmed Lyndon Johnson. Remember, by 67, we had 500,000 troops in Vietnam. We were suffering huge losses, relatively speaking, and Johnson decided not to run for a re-election in 1968 based on the poor opinion of him due to Vietnam. He did take his name away and try to start some negotiations to end the Vietnamese conflict, but the Republican running against whatever Democratic presidential nominee would be there, the Republican Richard Nixon promised to end the war. The public came to understand that he was going to end the war. And Richard Nixon, while he wasn't able to admit that he didn't know how to end the war, he decided to start a policy known as Vietnamization. Vietnamization was his effort to try to live up to that idea to end the war, and in order to do so, he argued that the United States should start replacing American troops with Vietnamese troops. And in this way, by making the war one that the South Vietnamese had to win, it took the responsibility off the United States, and American soldiers wouldn't die fighting the North Vietnamese. This turned out to be completely unworkable. The South Vietnamese didn't really want to fight the war, and those that were, the government that we were supporting was relatively corrupt or inept. So the policy of Vietnamization turned out not to be one that was usable. Nixon, in return, does escalate the war, which we'll talk about in a moment. At the same time, Nixon is talking about ending the war in Vietnam and starting this policy of Vietnamization, replacing American troops in Vietnam with Vietnamese troops. He also escalated the war, and he did this partially in secret. He authorized this massive bombing campaign of neighboring countries, Laos and Cambodia, in order to try to get to the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, known as the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, as they were supplying troops in South Vietnam, supplying the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. This massive secret bombing campaign of Laos and Cambodia was not only illegal, we weren't at war with those two countries, but it also led to a massive protest campaign. There was a massive peace march in Washington once the secret was let out. Nixon tried to counter this opposition by ending the draft and replacing the draft with a lottery system. This did calm down things a little bit, but once the United States invaded Cambodia to try to put an end to the Ho Chi Minh Trail, that opposition and protest started back up again. The protests led to the protests were nationwide. The most famous of which was the Kent State protest in Ohio. And at Kent State, National Guard's troops were sent to Kent State to try to pacify the students there at that campus. In the massive confusion, the National Guardsmen actually fired upon the students, killing, I believe, 3 Kent State students in that what's called Kent State Massacre. This is going to lead to even more opposition to Nixon's efforts, and Nixon is going to try to end the war at that point. When we look at the end of the Vietnamese War, it's very important to remember the context of the Cold War. The purpose of fighting in Vietnam was to implement the policy of containment, stopping communism from spreading. Nixon came into office having been the vice president under Dwight Eisenhower, and before that he was even seen as what's called a Cold Warrior, right? Somebody that was willing to do whatever it took to fight communism. With those credentials in place, he had some slack that he could use. So it's been argued that what Nixon does to end the Cold War, the Vietnam War, not many other people could have done because he had some gravitas in this situation. Nixon actually opened a dialogue with communist China, recognized China, in fact, trying to both get the Chinese to stop supporting North Vietnam so that the United States would have more bargaining power when it came to signing a treaty to end the Vietnam War. Also, he started negotiating with China as a way to hurt the communist relationship between China and the Soviet Union. People didn't realize it at the time, but the Soviet Union was communist and the Chinese were communist, but they didn't really like each other. There was an assumption that they were on the same page because they were both communist. By doing this, Nixon not only put the United States in a position to end the Vietnam War, but also opened up a policy known as détente. Détente is a French word, literally means to thaw. So he's thawing out the relationship with the Soviet Union in order to play the Soviet Union and China off each other. Nixon even went to China at one point in order to beef up his relationship there. And he's really trying to thaw out the relationship so that the United States can be in a better situation. Long story short, on the eve of the 1972 elections, Nixon announces that he has a peace agreement in place with North Vietnam. The American forces are going to withdraw by 1973. All the American prisoners of war would be returned at that point. Not all of the soldiers that were missing in action were prisoners of war. So this becomes another issue dealing with the Vietnam War, the return of soldiers that were missing. In 1975, after Nixon is out of office at this point, and after the United States has pulled out all military support in South Vietnam, Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, falls to the North Vietnamese again in 1975, officially making the war over. And really, it shows that the containment policy had failed in Southeast Asia. Vietnam lives on in the American cultural memory. partially because it's the first war that America lost. It's a failed war effort. It has huge implications on the returning veterans and the perception of them. Um, the United States lost 58,000 American soldiers in Vietnam, most of them killed in action or killed there, but many also prisoners of war, missing in action soldiers. Um, Bigger than that, though, uh, and that's a huge piece. It leads to cultural issues. But even bigger than that is this is a cultural phenomenon, and it really called America into questioning its core values. There was incidents like the My Lai massacre, where Lieutenant Cully was on a mission in leading a platoon, and they just totally. He ordered the platoon to kill all of the Vietnamese villagers, men, women, and children, because he kind of snapped. Lieutenant Cully was brought up on charges, and there was a large contingent, mostly conservatives, that supported Cully in his actions because they didn't support the way the war was being waged. They thought that the people back home weren't supporting the troops well enough, and that was causing all these problems. The Americans had to deal with the use of Agent Orange, which is a toxic chemical, kind of like Roundup that you put on your grass. Agent Orange was used to deforest huge swaths of the Vietnamese jungle, and it caused birth defects and cancer within people that came in contact with it. The use of napalm, which is like this sticky bomb that when it gets on your skin, you can't take it off. There was a heavy use of drugs among the troops in Vietnam because many of them didn't want to be there. Many of the soldiers that didn't want to, well, not many, some of the soldiers that didn't want to be there took it upon themselves to keep themselves out of harm's way when they didn't agree with their officers by committing an act of fragging. Fragging is when you kill one of your own. There was mistreatment of veterans when they came home. There's stories of veterans being protested against, being mistreated as they arrived on the airport. The bigger deal of this, though, is that and I think the most important part of this is that there was a distrust created between the generations, the older generation and the younger generation, right? This is the generation that lost the war. This is the generation that protested American involvement. But bigger than that even is the distrust between the people and their government. When the Pentagon Papers were released, which was a series of documents from the military, when they're released and published, it created what's called a credibility gap. Meaning that the people stopped trusting the government, that the government wasn't always honest with them. To try to counteract that, Congress tried to pass the War Powers Act and take away the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and re-implement that requirement that the president work through Congress to declare war. But at this point, the damage was largely done. There's really no good place to talk about this in this chronology that we're building. But the Watergate scandal happened as a result of the ending of the Vietnam War. Nixon is going to be running for re-election in 1972, and in the campaign, he wanted to get as much information on the Democratic side as he could. There were leaks that were coming out, meaning documents were being released from inside his White House administration and given to the press, things like the Pentagon Papers. As a result of this, Nixon wanted to, quote unquote, plug the leaks. So he created a group known as the Plumbers, very creative of him, to fix the leaks. These plumbers were authorized by him to do whatever was necessary to help him keep his position as president and help for his reelection. The plumbers took it upon themselves to break into the Democratic National Committee's headquarters. This is the committee that was running the election campaign for the Democratic side. They broke into the Watergate Hotel, which is where the DNC was, and they were caught. And in this break-in, which is a long story, and you should really Google it and read about it. It's very interesting. But as part of this, the people that broke in had connections to the White House, and they called the White House, which eventually it worked its way up to Richard Nixon, and Nixon tried to cover up this break-in. And again, there's a long process to this. At one point, Nixon, it's found out that Nixon was recording all of his conversations in the White House, and there was recordings of him telling his administration to try to cover up the scandal. He refuses to give up the tapes. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court orders the president to give the tapes to the prosecutors. He gives them the tape, but with 18 minutes erased. It creates this whole constitutional crisis. Nixon, because of this scandal, is about to be brought up on impeachment charges. Please remember, impeachment is just the formal process of having a trial. We've had two presidents impeached, Johnson and Andrew Johnson during Reconstruction, and Bill Clinton in the 1990s. Nixon is never formally impeached, although there was hearings to start the impeachment, and instead he resigned over this scandal. This, in addition to things like the Pentagon Papers and the credibility gap, just increased the distrust between the people and their government.